Lyra had always known that being different meant facing harder choices. Her mother was human, descended from the first wave of space colonists who left Earth centuries ago. Her father came from the elf worlds of Tau Ceti, planets where ancient traditions and natural magic still held sway over daily life. Growing up between two worlds meant she belonged fully to neither, yet carried the strengths and burdens of both. When she was young, the other elf children mocked her for her human appearance, while human colonists whispered that she was too strange, too otherworldly for their communities. By the time Lyra turned 18, she had already made up her mind to forge her own path. She refused to accept the limits that society wanted to place on her. While other young elves pursued traditional roles in forest conservation and natural magic, Lyra spent countless hours studying astronomy, physics, and advanced technology. Her instructors at the academy were not sure what to make of her. She had the intellectual capacity and the creative thinking needed for scientific research, but her background made many people uncomfortable. Some professors questioned whether someone with her mixed heritage could truly understand the refined logical structures needed for pure science. When Lyra applied to the Galactic Research Council at age 22, she was rejected 3 times. The rejection letters were polite and formal, filled with phrases about competitive selection processes and the need for more experience. But she knew the real reason. In interviews, council members would mention her background with barely concealed skepticism. One interviewer had actually asked if she could adapt to the rigorous standards of scientific work, given that elf culture traditionally relied on intuition rather than methodology. That question had stung more than the rejections themselves. Undeterred, Lyra purchased a small research vessel using her savings and a substantial loan from her mother. It was an older model, not equipped with the latest technology, but it was seaworthy and reliable. She named it the Pathfinder, hoping that it would carry her toward the discoveries that everyone told her she could never make. She spent 2 years exploring uninhabited star systems, documenting geological formations, cataloging new minerals, and studying the energy patterns of distant planets. Her work was solid and publishable, but without the backing of a major research institution, her findings attracted little attention from the broader scientific community. Then came Kepler 442. Lyra had noticed the unusual energy signatures while reviewing gravitational data from the outer regions of the Kepler 442 system. Most scientists would have dismissed them as sensor artifacts or anomalies caused by stellar activity. But Lyra had inherited something from her elf father that science could not explain, something that modern instruments could barely measure. She could feel the presence of ancient intelligence the way elves have always sensed life in forests and mountains. The signals called to her in a way that pure data analysis could never explain. She had submitted a formal research proposal to the Galactic Research Council, requesting permission to investigate the planet and requesting limited funding to support the expedition. The response had been swift and dismissive. A senior council member had written that the planet showed no signs of supporting life, and that the energy signatures were easily explained by natural geological processes. The council suggested that Lyra spend her time studying more promising locations. The letter ended with a patronizing note expressing hope that she would eventually focus her talents on more practical endeavors. Lyra had read that rejection letter only once before deleting it. She did not need their permission or their funding. She plotted a course for Kepler 442b on her own authority and prepared the Pathfinder for the journey. The trip would take 3 months at maximum speed. She spent that time maintaining her vessel, updating her equipment, and most importantly, working on the 2 creatures that would change everything about her mission. She had purchased them on a black market station orbiting an abandoned moon in the Andromeda Fringe. The traders there dealt in rare and exotic animals, creatures that wealthy collectors would pay fortunes to own. The first dragon she saw was Ember, kept in a small cage that was far too small for his growing body. His scales had dulled from lack of sunlight and proper nutrition. He had seemed almost lifeless, his golden color faded to a dull gray. When she looked into his eyes, she saw intelligence trapped behind bars, a mind and spirit waiting for release. The second dragon, Ash, had been in even worse condition. A smaller female, she bore scars from being handled roughly and housed alongside other captured creatures. Her violet markings, which should have glowed with vibrant energy, were barely visible beneath layers of grime and neglect. The traders had wanted an enormous sum of money for both creatures. Lyra had negotiated for hours, using every argument she could think of. She explained that she was a scientist who wanted to study them, that she would provide them with proper care, that keeping them alive was her primary concern. The traders did not care about the dragon's welfare. They cared only about profit. But Lyra was persistent, and eventually they agreed to a price that was still far too high but slightly more reasonable than their initial demand. She had drained most of her remaining savings to purchase the two creatures, but the moment she held Ember's scarred claw in her hand, she knew she had made the right choice. The recovery process had taken months. Lyra set up a specially designed habitat in her ship's cargo hold, creating conditions that she researched extensively from ancient texts about dragon biology. She fed them proper nutrition, cleansed their wounds, and slowly helped them rebuild their strength. During those long nights in space, traveling alone toward her destination, she would sit with the two dragons and talk to them about her dreams. She told them about the mocking looks from the council, about the people who had doubted her abilities, about her determination to prove that she belonged among the stars. Ember had been the first to show signs of recovery. After 3 weeks of proper care, his scales began to regain their golden hue. His eyes grew brighter, more alert. Ash took longer to heal. She had been more traumatized by her captivity, more withdrawn and fearful of human interaction. But Lyra had patience. She moved slowly around Ash, never making sudden movements, speaking in soft and gentle tones. Gradually, the smaller dragon began to trust her. After 2 months, Ash would rest her head against Lyra's chest as the elf woman worked on her medical scans and injury treatment. By the time the Pathfinder entered the Kepler 442 system, both dragons had recovered to nearly full health. They were no longer thin and weakened. Ember's scales shone with restored luminescence, each one catching and reflecting light in beautiful patterns. Ash's violet markings had become vivid and striking, but more importantly, they had formed deep bonds with Lyra. These were not pets or experimental subjects. They were companions, partners in exploration, creatures who had been given a second chance at life. The other research teams already studying Kepler 442b had established a small base camp on the larger of the system's inhabited planets. When Lyra arrived and transmitted her identification codes, the response had been cold and unwelcoming. The base commander had informed her that independent researchers were not allowed in the system, without authorization from the Council. Lyra had politely informed him that the outer planets were not under Council jurisdiction, and that she had every legal right to conduct her research in uninhabited regions. The commander had not been pleased, but he could not stop her. Lyra had guided the Pathfinder to a stable orbit around Kepler 442b and began conducting more detailed scans of the mountain ranges where the energy signatures were strongest. The Council team had tried to jam her communications, but her equipment was old enough that she had learned to work around most interference patterns. She spent weeks gathering data, confirming that there was definitely something significant beneath the surface of the planet. The ridicule from the Council team had been constant. On open communications channels, researchers had joked about the half-breed elf who had delusions of making important discoveries. One scientist had suggested that Lyra was wasting fuel and resources on wild goose chases. Another had actually recommended that the Council file official complaints about her presence in the system, claiming that independent researchers like her degraded the reputation of legitimate science. Those words had stung, but they had also strengthened Lyra's resolve. She would prove them wrong. She would make them see that heritage meant nothing, and determination meant everything. As the Kepler 442b sun had set on the day before her planned descent, Lyra had stood in the observation deck with her two dragons. Ember had pressed his large head against her shoulder. Ash had wrapped around her arm. She had felt their warmth, their trust, and their readiness for what was coming. Whatever lay beneath those mountains, whatever ancient secrets had been preserved in that hidden facility, Lyra knew that she was not alone. She had chosen her companions well, and they had chosen to stand beside her. Tomorrow everything would change. Tomorrow, the world would begin to understand that an elf woman and her dragons could accomplish things that the entire Council could never achieve. The shuttle descended through Kepler 442b's atmosphere with practiced precision. Lyra had made this journey before in simulations, but experiencing it in reality was entirely different. The ship's hull heated from atmospheric friction as she guided it toward the landing zone she had carefully selected. Through the viewport, she could see the planet's surface becoming clearer. The mountains looked ancient, weathered by millions of years of wind and rain. Their slopes were covered in vegetation that glowed faintly in the dimming light of the setting sun. Ember and Ash sat behind her in specially designed harnesses that allowed them to remain comfortable during the descent without interfering with Lyra's piloting. The larger dragon made a low rumbling sound, a vocalization that Lyra had learned meant curiosity and anticipation. Ash's violet markings began to glow more brightly, something that happened when the dragon became emotionally excited. Lyra smiled. She understood their feelings completely. This moment represented something crucial for all three of them. The landing coordinates placed her on a rocky plateau that extended from a series of narrow canyons. According to her scans, the strongest energy signatures emanated from deep within these canyons, possibly from underground structures that had been buried for ages. The plateau was large enough to land the shuttle safely, and far enough removed from populated areas that she would not immediately draw attention from the Council's researchers on the main planet. As the shuttle touched down, dust rose in clouds around the landing struts. Lyra ran through the shutdown sequence, checking each system carefully. She had learned from experience that rushing this process could lead to problems during launch. Once everything was secure, she turned to face her two companions. She placed one hand on each dragon, feeling their scaled skin beneath her fingers. Lyra had spent years learning how to communicate with the dragons. They did not use human language, but they possessed their own system of vocalizations, body language, and something that felt almost telepathic when she was near them. She could sense their moods and intentions the way she could sense the presence of ancient intelligence that had drawn her to this world. Now she projected calm determination toward them. She wanted them to understand that this exploration was important, that they needed to remain alert but not fearful, and that she trusted them completely. The three of them suited up for the descent. Lyra wore a specialized exploration suit that incorporated both advanced human technology and modifications she had designed herself, based on elf environmental adaptation principles. The suit had extra flexibility in the joints and incorporated materials that could shift between insulation and ventilation, depending on conditions. For the dragons, she had created lighter harnesses that would allow them to communicate with her while maintaining some protection from the harsh environment. The plateau was eerily quiet when they stepped outside. The thin air created an almost ethereal quality to the landscape. Dust particles seemed to hang suspended in the atmosphere, illuminated by the fading sunlight. Lyra's scanner began picking up the energy signatures immediately. They were much stronger here, much closer to the surface than she had anticipated. She began to suspect that the buried facility was not as deep as she had initially calculated. As they walked across the plateau, heading toward the canyon system, Lyra explained her theory to the dragons. It was something she often did, using them as sounding boards for her scientific thinking. She theorized that the ancient civilization might have used the canyons as natural protection, building their facility in locations where the rock formations provided both shelter and shielding from external sensors. If that was true, then the entrance might be surprisingly visible once they got close enough. The canyon system revealed itself as they approached. What had appeared from the shuttle to be simply rocky terrain became a series of dramatic formations as they drew near. The canyons cut deep into the planet's crust, creating passages that seemed to lead downward into shadow and mystery. Lyra consulted her scanner, allowing the energy signatures to guide her toward a particular section where several readings seemed to converge. The entrance, when they found it, took her breath away. It was massive, carved from the living rock with geometric precision that no natural process could have created. The edges were smooth and true, suggesting that some kind of advanced cutting technology had been used. The entrance itself was approximately 30 meters wide and 20 meters tall, plenty of space for the dragons to move through comfortably. Bioluminescent panels lined the walls, dormant now but clearly designed to provide illumination. Lyra approached the entrance with her scanner extended. As she drew closer, the panels began to glow. Soft blue light spread across the stone walls, gradually brightening as she moved further inside. The effect was breathtaking. It was as if the facility itself was waking up after a long sleep, responding to her presence. Ember pressed close to her side and Ash flew to land on her shoulder, the smaller dragon's weight a comforting presence. The interior of the facility was unlike anything Lyra had expected. Instead of the cramped and utilitarian spaces she might have anticipated, she found herself in a vast chamber that stretched upward for what seemed like hundreds of meters. The walls were smooth and appeared to be some kind of advanced composite material. Holographic projectors were positioned at regular intervals, though most seemed to be inactive. The floor was covered in a fine dust that had accumulated over untold centuries. As Lyra moved deeper into the chamber, more panels activated, revealing a vast expanse of technological marvels. She saw evidence of machinery that had once processed enormous amounts of information. Storage units lined entire walls, each one potentially containing vast archives of data. Workstations were arranged in orderly rows, their surfaces covered in layers of dust but still seemingly intact. It was clear that whoever had built this facility had intended it to last, to preserve something important for whoever might eventually discover it. The dragons moved through the chamber with her, their senses attuned to the subtle currents of ancient energy that still pulsed through the facility. Ember stopped periodically to examine certain areas more carefully, as if drawn to them by instincts that Lyra did not fully understand. Ash remained on her shoulder, occasionally making soft chirping sounds that seemed almost questioning. Lyra's scientific mind was racing. The technology she was seeing was far more advanced than anything humanity had developed, even more advanced than the cutting-edge systems used by the Galactic Research Council. And yet it was also beautiful in a way that suggested the designers had valued aesthetics as much as functionality. The layout of the facility seemed to follow principles of natural harmony that reminded her of elf architecture. Though on a vastly larger scale, she discovered a central chamber at the heart of the facility, accessed through a corridor that descended gradually deeper into the planet. Here the technology became even more impressive. Massive crystalline structures rose from the floor like formations in a natural cave, but clearly artificial in their perfect geometric forms. These structures glowed with faint internal light, suggesting that they still possessed some form of active power source. This was extraordinary. Most technology from truly ancient civilizations would have lost all power after millions of years. But these crystals appeared to have tapped into some form of renewable energy source, possibly drawing power from the planet's core itself. In the center of this chamber stood a pedestal, and upon it rested a crystal that was larger and more luminous than all the others. Lyra approached it slowly, aware that she was now in the presence of something profoundly important. Her scanner had gone wild, registering energy patterns it could barely categorize. The crystal seemed to pulse with its own rhythm, almost like a heartbeat. As she drew closer, images began to flicker across the holographic projectors. They showed star maps, some familiar and some depicting regions of space that Lyra had never encountered. They showed worlds and civilizations, some thriving and some in ruins. They showed events that must have spanned millions of years of history. The scale of it was staggering. This facility was not just a research station. It was an archive of knowledge, a preservation chamber for the accumulated wisdom of a civilization that had achieved heights that humanity could barely imagine. Ember and Ash seemed to sense the significance of what they were witnessing. The dragons moved closer to Lyra, their presence grounding her as she struggled to comprehend the implications of what she was seeing. She understood suddenly that this discovery would change everything. The Galactic Research Council would have to acknowledge her work. The people who had mocked her would have to face the evidence of her abilities. But more than that, humanity would have to confront the reality that they were not alone, that they were not the most advanced civilization in the galaxy, and that there was a vast history of achievement and knowledge waiting to be understood. The moment Lyra's hand made contact with the crystal, her mind exploded with sensation. It was not painful, but rather overwhelming in its intensity. Images flooded her consciousness, not appearing one at a time but all at once, layered and interconnected in ways that her brain struggled to process. She saw the birth of stars, watched as planets formed from cosmic dust, witnessed the emergence of life in countless forms across the galaxy. The visions showed her civilizations rising and falling like waves on an ocean. She saw beings of pure energy, creatures of crystalline structure, beings of flesh and bone that resembled both humans and elves in different proportions. Some civilizations had achieved incredible technological mastery, building megastructures that spanned star systems. Others had chosen to remain close to nature, developing their societies in harmony with their planetary environments. Most had eventually fallen, consumed by war or natural disaster or the simple entropy that seemed to claim all things eventually. But one civilization had been different. They had discovered something that transcended the cycles of rise and fall. They had found a way to preserve knowledge, to prevent the loss of accumulated wisdom when civilizations disappeared. They had built archives like this one, scattered throughout the galaxy, designed to endure for millions of years and to pass their understanding on to whatever civilization might eventually discover them. The crystal showed Lyra their history in vivid detail. This ancient race had been called the Architects, though that was merely a human translation of concepts that had no direct parallel in any current language. They had lived approximately 7 million years ago, during a time when the galaxy was very different from the present day. They had been simultaneously scientists, artists, and philosophers, viewing knowledge not as something to be hoarded but as something to be shared and celebrated. The Architects had encountered many species during their explorations of the galaxy. Some they had helped, offering technology and wisdom to fledgling civilizations. Others they had simply observed, believing that some species needed to find their own path without outside interference. They had maintained a strict ethical code, believing that the right to knowledge came with the responsibility to use it wisely. They had spread their archives throughout space as gifts to the future, hopes that whatever intelligence eventually succeeded them would benefit from everything they had learned. Then came the images that changed everything for Lyra. The crystal showed her something else, something that the Architects had hidden within this facility, specifically for certain types of minds to discover. They had encoded a message in the facility's deepest levels, a message that could only be accessed by beings who possessed the right combination of intellect, intuition, and spiritual awareness. The crystal was showing her the location of that message and providing her with the access codes that would allow her to unlock it. But there was more. The visions continued, showing Lyra the present day and the immediate future. She saw the Galactic Research Council, saw its leaders making decisions that would suppress and hide knowledge like this from the general population. She saw power struggles and political maneuvering designed to maintain control over scientific advancement. And she saw herself standing at a crucial junction, able to either keep silent and protect herself or speak the truth and change everything. The crystal also showed her something else, something deeply personal. It revealed to her that Ember and Ash were not merely random creatures she had rescued. Dragons had a special connection to ancient energy patterns, a sensitivity that had been deliberately preserved by the Architects. They had created the dragons thousands of years ago, or at least influenced their evolution, specifically to serve as companions and partners for those who would discover their archives. Ember and Ash had been drawn to Lyra because they sensed something in her, a combination of human and elf traits that made her uniquely suited to access the deepest levels of this facility. When Lyra finally withdrew her hand from the crystal, she collapsed to her knees, gasping for breath. Her mind felt expanded and altered, as if her capacity for understanding had been permanently increased. The visions faded gradually, but the knowledge they contained remained crystal clear in her memory. She looked up to see Ember and Ash standing protectively on either side of her, their eyes glowing with concern and purpose. The holographic projectors throughout the facility had activated fully now, displaying information on every available surface. Lyra forced herself to stand, her legs shaky but her determination unwavering. She pulled out the portable data storage devices she had brought with her, devices that she had specifically modified to be able to handle the huge amount of information that ancient archives might contain. She began interfacing with the facility's computer systems, downloading everything she could access. The system was surprisingly cooperative. It seemed designed to share its knowledge with those who demonstrated the right qualities. The ancient Architects had built redundancy and protection into their systems, ensuring that surface-level information could be accessed by many, but deeper secrets were reserved only for those who could pass the tests inherent in the central crystal. Lyra had passed those tests, and now the facility was opening itself to her completely. As she worked, downloading terabytes of data, Lyra's mind continued processing what she had learned. The Architects had not disappeared. They had simply evolved beyond physical form, transcending the limitations of matter and becoming beings of pure consciousness. They observed the galaxy still, watched as civilizations rose and fell, but they did not intervene directly. They had left their archives as their legacy, their way of guiding the future without controlling it. The warning came suddenly. Lyra's portable scanner began flashing urgently, indicating multiple ships entering the planet's atmosphere. She looked up from her work, her heart sinking. The Council had somehow detected her activity, or perhaps they had been tracking her all along, waiting to see what she would discover before moving in to suppress it. She did not have time to download everything. She had to make a choice about what was most critical to preserve. Lyra made her decision quickly. She set the device to focus on the most foundational data, the scientific principles that the architects had developed, the historical records that proved their existence and the existence of other ancient civilizations. She would not be able to get everything, but she would get enough. She would get more than enough to change the course of scientific history and to prove that she had been right all along. The download continued at high speed, pulling vast amounts of information from the architect's systems into her portable devices. Outside the facility, Lyra could hear the sounds of shuttle engines and the opening of landing hatches. The Council forces were establishing positions around the canyon system. They would move into the facility soon. Ember suddenly moved toward the entrance, his body tense with readiness. Ash flew overhead, making the kind of aggressive vocalizations that Lyra had never heard from the smaller dragon before. The dragons understood what was happening. They were prepared to protect their companion and the knowledge they had all come to discover together. Lyra worked faster, almost frantic in her efforts to complete the download. The progress bar on her device showed 90%, 95%, 98%. She willed it faster, knowing that every second counted. Outside, she could hear voices and the sound of armored boots on stone. The Council security forces were coming. 100%. The download completed. Lyra immediately disconnected the device and secured it in the waterproof, impact-resistant case she had brought specifically for this purpose. She fastened it to her suit's utility belt, the weight of accumulated knowledge now physically present and protected. All the secrets that the Council wanted to keep hidden, all the evidence of her discovery, all the proof of ancient civilizations and lost wisdom, was now in her possession. She looked at Ember and Ash, seeing the readiness in their eyes. All three of them understood what came next. The easy part was over. The discovery was made, but now came the difficult part, the part where they would have to fight to protect what they had found and ensure that the truth reached the wider galaxy. Lyra pulled out the detonator for the small charges she had placed throughout the facility before entering the central chamber. Insurance against exactly this kind of situation. She did not want to destroy knowledge, but she was willing to bury it again if necessary. The data was safe now. The information would get out. And as for this facility, if the Council wanted to suppress it, they would find that the elf woman and her dragons had made sure that was far more complicated than they had anticipated. Lyra pressed the ignition sequence on the detonator, and the mountain began to shake. The charges detonated in controlled sequence, designed to collapse the central chamber and bury the deepest levels of the facility without destroying its entirety. Massive chunks of rock fell from the ceiling, crashing down on the holographic projectors and the sophisticated computer systems. Dust erupted in massive clouds, filling the chamber with a gray haze that limited visibility to just a few meters. Lyra ran toward the entrance, Ember thundering ahead of her with Ash flying close behind. The Council security forces had been advancing into the facility when the charges detonated. The sudden collapse caught 3 of their squad members in the destruction, burying them under fallen rock. The rest of the team scattered, retreating toward the entrance to avoid being trapped underground. Lyra used the chaos and dust to her advantage, moving through the mayhem with practiced speed. She did not try to fight the security personnel. She simply moved past them, using the dragons as both shield and pathfinder. Ember's bulk allowed him to push through obstacles that would have stopped a human. His powerful legs drove him forward through the collapsing tunnel, and Lyra ran in his wake, following the path the dragon created. Ash flew overhead, avoiding the falling debris and providing early warning of obstacles ahead. The 3 of them worked in perfect synchronization, each one understanding what the others needed without requiring verbal communication. Behind them, the Council security forces were attempting to organize a pursuit, but the destruction and the dragon's aggressive defense made it difficult. Ash descended on one officer who tried to grab Lyra, forcing him to retreat by snapping her jaws just inches from his face. Ember knocked another officer aside with a casual swipe of his massive tail that sent the man flying backward. They were not trying to kill anyone, just creating space, just doing whatever was necessary to escape. They burst out of the facility into the crimson sunlight of late afternoon. The council's shuttle was positioned on the plateau, but Lyra had no intention of trying to reach it. Instead, she headed directly toward the canyon system, where she had left the Pathfinder's smaller shuttle. The council forces emerged from the facility behind her, a squad of about 10 soldiers now coordinated and moving with military precision. Lyra reached the shuttle and wrenched the hatch open. Ember practically flew inside, his powerful body launching him into the cargo area. Ash landed on the pilot seat just as Lyra dropped into her position. Her hands flew across the controls, running through startup sequences that would normally take 5 minutes in record time. The shuttle's engines began to hum to life, power flowing through systems that had been standing by for this exact moment. The soldiers were getting closer. Lyra could hear the sound of their boots on stone, could hear voices shouting commands. Someone fired at the shuttle, plasma bolts impacting against the hull but not penetrating. She had reinforced this vessel extensively during her preparation, knowing that things might come to this. The engines reached full power. Lyra engaged the thrusters just as several council soldiers reached the shuttle's landing ramp. One of them tried to grab the ramp's edge to prevent her from retracting it, but Ember rose up and roared, a sound of such primal power that the soldier immediately released his grip and fell backward. The ramp sealed, locking out the pursuing forces. The shuttle lifted off, and for a moment Lyra thought they had made it. The vessel rose above the canyon system, climbing toward open sky. Behind them on the plateau, she could see more council shuttles on the ground, and in the sky above them, 3 atmospheric fighters were beginning to take off in pursuit. She pushed the shuttle to its maximum speed, guiding it toward the upper atmosphere where the air would be thin enough to provide no resistance. The 3 fighters were faster and more maneuverable than her cargo shuttle, but they were not faster than determination and desperation. Lyra pulled up the navigation system and entered a sequence of maneuvers that she had calculated during her descent to the surface. The pursuit became intense. Plasma fire filled the sky around her as the fighters tried to hem her in. Lyra dodged and weaved, using her intimate knowledge of the planetary geography to her advantage. She flew low through valleys, skimmed across mountain ridges, and dove into terrain that the fighter pilots would not dare to attempt. One of the pursuing fighters tried to follow her through a narrow canyon pass and clipped a rock formation, causing it to veer wildly off course. Behind her, from the cargo area, she heard Ember roar again. The dragon was pressing against the shuttle's viewport, watching the pursuers with an intensity that suggested he wanted to join the chase. Ash was perched on the emergency console, her violet markings glowing so brightly they illuminated the entire cockpit. The shuttle broke through into the upper atmosphere. The air became thinner and thinner until it was almost a vacuum. Here, in the realm between planet and space, the pursuing fighters could not follow as effectively. The shuttle's engines, which had been designed for long-term space travel, performed far better in these conditions than the fighters' atmospheric engines. Lyra pulled upward, climbing away from the planet's gravity well. Behind her, the 3 fighters were falling back, unable to match her climb rate. Within minutes, they gave up the pursuit and returned to the planet's atmosphere. Lyra allowed herself to breathe again, to let the adrenaline begin its slow retreat from her system. They had made it. They were free. She engaged the communication system and sent an automated signal toward the Pathfinder in orbit. The larger vessel received the signal and automatically began undocking from the station it had been maintaining. By the time Lyra's shuttle reached the outer atmosphere and transitioned into true space, the Pathfinder was already moving to intercept her position. The docking sequence was perfect, the shuttle gliding into the Pathfinder's cargo bay with precision. Lyra locked down the controls and immediately turned to check on her companions. Ember was already removing his restraints, his massive body unfolding as he moved toward her. Ash descended from the console and landed on Lyra's shoulder, the dragon's weight familiar and comforting. Lyra checked the data storage device attached to her belt. It was still secure, still functional. The information was safe. Everything they had fought for, everything they had risked, was now secured and ready to be transmitted to the wider galaxy. But first, she needed to put distance between herself and the Council forces. She needed to reach a neutral location where she could broadcast the information publicly before anyone could intercept it or suppress it. She moved to the navigation console and plotted a course that would take her toward the independent news networks that operated in the fringe colonies. These networks were not controlled by the Galactic Research Council or any of the major governmental bodies. They reported news that the official channels would never touch. If she could get her information to them, if she could make the data public before the council could move to suppress it, then the truth would be impossible to contain. The Pathfinder's engines powered up, the gentle vibration of space travel replacing the roar of atmospheric flight. Lyra guided the vessel away from Kepler 442b, leaving behind the canyon system where she had made the greatest discovery of her life. In the back of her mind, she was already composing what she would say to the news networks, the words she would use to explain what the ancient architects had built, what knowledge they had preserved, and why that knowledge needed to be shared with all of humanity. Ember and Ash settled down in the main cabin, their alertness gradually giving way to the exhaustion that came after intense exertion. Lyra watched them for a moment, seeing the trust in their eyes, the absolute certainty that they had done the right thing. She reached out and placed her hand on Ember's scaled head, and the dragon made a soft rumbling sound of contentment. They had escaped with the truth. Now came the hardest part, ensuring that the truth would be heard and believed by a galaxy that had been taught to dismiss and doubt the very person who had discovered it. Lyra set the Pathfinder's course, engaged the long-distance communication systems, and began preparing the data for transmission. The storm was coming, and she was ready to face it. The journey to the fringe colonies took 2 weeks, time that Lyra used to prepare her broadcast and review the data she had collected. She spent countless hours analyzing the information from the architects, making sure she understood it well enough to explain it clearly to an audience that had no prior knowledge of ancient civilizations. She created presentations, organized the historical records, and developed a narrative that would walk humanity through the most significant discovery in recorded history. Ember and Ash spent those 2 weeks recovering from their ordeal. Lyra set up special facilities in the cargo hold where they could rest and regain their strength. She fed them the finest nutrition, provided them with access to the ship's medical facilities, and spent many hours simply sitting with them, talking about what they had experienced and what was coming next. The dragons seemed to understand that something important was about to happen. They remained close to her, rarely straying far from the command deck. As the Pathfinder approached the fringe colonies, Lyra detected multiple council vessels moving to intercept her. They had traced her location and were attempting to catch her before she could make contact with the independent news networks. Lyra recognized their ship signatures and knew she did not have much time. She immediately began transmitting the data, sending it simultaneously to every independent news network she could identify in the colonial communication network. The moment her transmission began, the council vessels increased their speed. But it was too late. Lyra had already uploaded the foundational data, enough for the networks to begin verifying and analyzing what she had discovered. She kept transmitting, pushing more and more information into the public domain, ensuring that no amount of council interference could fully contain the truth. The council vessels demanded that she cut her transmission immediately. They threatened her with arrest, with confiscation of her vessel, with a long list of violations and crimes that they claimed she had committed. Lyra ignored them all and continued transmitting. By the time the council ships came close enough to attempt an interception, Lyra had broadcasted enough information to change everything. Within hours, independent news networks across the fringe began reporting on her discovery. The story spread like wildfire, impossible to suppress or contain. Scientists who had been dismissed as fringe theorists suddenly found evidence supporting their work. Historians who had speculated about ancient civilizations now had concrete data to support their theories. The data Lyra had transmitted was irrefutable, verified by multiple independent laboratories, and completely changing the picture of galactic history that everyone had believed in. The Galactic Research Council tried to discredit her. Senior officials gave press conferences claiming that the data was fabricated, that Lyra was a charlatan who had somehow created an elaborate hoax using advanced technology and falsified records. But they had not anticipated the international response. Scientists from dozens of worlds demanded immediate access to the ancient facility on Kepler 442b. Independent research teams began mobilizing to launch expeditions toward the planet. The Council could not stop them all. Within a week, the Council's position became untenable. Multiple Council members began defecting, offering to provide testimony that the Council had deliberately suppressed knowledge of ancient alien civilizations. It became clear that Lyra's discovery had been only the first layer of a much deeper conspiracy. The Council had known about the possibility of ancient archives but had chosen to keep that information secret to maintain their monopoly on scientific advancement and discovery. Public pressure on the Council became intense. Demonstrations erupted in major cities throughout human space. Scientists demanded answers about what other knowledge had been suppressed. Governments began calling for investigations into Council operations. The careful balance of power that had kept the Council in authority began to crumble. 3 weeks after Lyra's initial transmission, she received a communication from a neutral diplomatic organization requesting her presence at a special session. They wanted her to present her findings in person, to give testimony about the discovery and about the Council's attempts to suppress her work. Lyra accepted immediately. This was the moment she had been waiting for. The chance to stand before the galaxy and explain the significance of what she had found. The special session took place on a massive space station that orbited Earth itself. Representatives from governments across known space attended, along with scientists, journalists, and curious citizens who had managed to secure admission to the public galleries. Lyra stood before them all, with Ember at her side and Ash perched on a specially designed stand just beside the speaking podium. She had decided that the dragons deserved to be recognized as part of this discovery, not hidden away as mere animals or instruments of her research. She began by explaining her background, talking about the discrimination and prejudice she had faced from the moment she began pursuing her scientific ambitions. She spoke about how the Council had rejected her research proposals, how they had doubted her abilities, how they had treated her mixed heritage as a disqualification rather than a potential strength. She explained this not to seek sympathy, but to set the context for how her determination had led her to make this discovery on her own terms, without institutional support or approval. Then she presented the data. She showed the ancient star charts that the architects had created. She displayed records of civilizations that had risen and fallen millions of years ago. She explained the principles of advanced technology that the architects had developed and preserved. The evidence was overwhelming, undeniable, and completely transformative, but Lyra did not stop there. She explained the deeper significance of what the architects had done. They had recognized that knowledge was too important to be lost to time. They had understood that civilizations could fail, that disasters could erase centuries of progress, but that if key information could be preserved and passed on to the next generation of intelligent beings to emerge in the galaxy, then the march of progress could continue uninterrupted. They had not left their archives as instruments of power or control. They had left them as gifts, as stepping stones toward greater understanding and achievement. She spoke about what this meant for humanity. They were not alone in the galaxy. They were not the most advanced civilization that had ever existed, but they had been chosen, in a sense, as the inheritors of architect knowledge. It was now humanity's responsibility to understand that knowledge, to use it wisely, and to eventually pass it on to the next civilization that would succeed them. This was not a burden but a tremendous opportunity. Finally, Lyra spoke about Ember and Ash. She explained that the dragons were not simply animals but were partners in this discovery, creatures whose connection to ancient energy patterns had made them essential to accessing the deepest levels of the architect facility. She described how they had been rescued from captivity and how they had proven themselves to be intelligent, loyal, and absolutely crucial to everything that had been accomplished. She emphasized that scientific discovery was not the domain of humans alone, but required collaboration and partnership with other species and intelligences. The response was extraordinary. Representatives from multiple worlds stood and applauded. Scientists shouted questions and requests for additional data. Journalists immediately began planning coverage of the historic moment. In the public galleries, people were weeping openly, overwhelmed by the implications of everything Lyra had revealed. Within days, the Galactic Research Council issued a statement announcing a complete restructuring of their organization. They acknowledged that they had suppressed knowledge and that this had been a grave error. They committed to open scientific sharing and promised full transparency in all future research. Multiple council members resigned in disgrace. New leadership was brought in with a mandate to reform the organization. From the ground up, Lyra was offered a position as the lead director of a new international research initiative focused on studying and preserving the knowledge left by the architects. She accepted, but with conditions. She insisted that the research team be composed of scientists from diverse backgrounds, including representatives from species that had traditionally been excluded from major scientific endeavors. She insisted that Ember and Ash be recognized as official partners in the research, with their needs and comfort being a priority. And she insisted that all findings would be immediately made public, with no information being suppressed or hidden for any reason. Over the following months and years, the discovery that Lyra had made transformed galactic civilization. Ancient facilities were found on dozens of worlds, each one containing knowledge that expanded humanity's understanding of science, technology, history, and philosophy. The architect's gifts kept giving, layer upon layer of wisdom being revealed as new researchers, working with creatures like Ember and Ash, learned to access deeper and deeper levels of the ancient archives.